Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me today for this version of IWF Reads Author Chat. And today we're going to be discussing this great book. Hope you can see it, No Way to Treat a Child. And it is how the foster care system, family courts, and racial activists are wrecking young lives. And it's written by Naomi Schaefer Riley. But before we invite Naomi to join me up here, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Carrie Lucas. I'm president of Independent Women's Forum. I want to give you a few tips on how to engage with us today during our talk with Naomi. On the right side of your screen, you'll see that there's like a chat room, and you'll be able to join the discussion with other attendees. And you'll see some IWF teammates of mine who have a T next to their name. So you'll know those are IWF staffers. And if you're not seeing the chat room, just select the arrows in the top right-hand corner of the chat window, and you should be able to get in there. And then next to the chat room, you're going to see there's a question tab, and you can go in there. And if you have a question, please post it. I'll be checking it out and try to tie some of those back into Naomi as I talk to her. And you can give other people's questions bumps so I can see them and know that you want to ask that question too. And then finally, and most importantly, at the end of our time today, we'll be drawing 3 names to win signed copies of Naomi's new book. So in order to win, you must be present during the time of the drawing at the end of today's events, and the books will be mailed to our door prize winners. And now that we have that kind of housekeeping out of the way, we can get to the main event. And so we're going to bring Naomi up here with me. All right, there we go. Hi, Naomi. Thank you so much for coming with me today, or coming on this today. First, let me give you a quick introduction for those of you who do not know Naomi Schaefer Riley. Most importantly, she's a senior fellow with the Independent Women's Forum. So that is definitely her most important title, but she's also a senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute. And she's the author of 6 books, including Be the Parent, Please, Stop Banning Seesaws and Start Banning Snapchat. And of course, we're about to discuss her 7th book, and I'm really excited to do so. She's a frequent contributor to a wide variety of publications, and really a true specialist in the field of parenting and child welfare, and that's particularly evident in this fantastic new book. So Naomi, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Carrie. It's great to be here.
Great. I was thinking about this, I completely enjoyed reading your book as much as one can enjoy reading a really depressing walkthrough the consequences, just the problems with our welfare, our child welfare system, and just how big a problem it is. But one thing I want us to talk a little bit about, like, the scope of this problem. And I thought it was helpful to compare this a little bit to COVID. Obviously, we've had so much attention, for good reason, on keeping kids safe from COVID. And I looked at the numbers, just knowing we were going to have this talk today. And there's been, as of October 6th, there's been 499 children under age 17 who've died from COVID during the course of the pandemic. That's troubling. It's a little bit less than what usually happens during the course of an average flu season. But then I was reading your book and saw the unbelievable numbers of children who have died in 2019 alone. 1,840 children died of child neglect and abuse. More than 600,000 American children were victims of abuse and neglect that year. That's staggering. That's should be headline making, and it's not. So why doesn't this issue get more attention?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, those numbers are probably even an underestimate. There are 3 million children a year who are reported for abuse or neglect. And, between about 700,000 of those we can substantiate. But that doesn't mean that the rest of those episodes did not actually happen. It just means that's what we have the evidence for. So child abuse and neglect is a widespread problem. I think there is definitely a sense that people don't want to talk about it. I mean, it's a very uncomfortable issue to talk about. I mean, just to give you just even an example of my own family, after we had kids, my husband said he could no longer watch Law and Order episodes that involved child abuse. So people are very uncomfortable with it. It's very disturbing. And I think people kind of tend to to look away. And when they do kind of look, I think the headlines are kind of a little bit misleading about what's going on. The first thing people think is that, child abuse is happening, in behind closed doors, that we don't know about these cases and there's nothing we could do because these children were locked in their basement and tortured and the neighbors professed they had no idea what was going on. That's not really the typical case of child abuse or neglect in this country. The worst part, I feel like, for most of my research is finding out that we are aware of who the abusers are in these situations. They've been reported multiple times, and we, as in the child welfare agencies and family courts, have chosen to leave them in those dangerous situations. So that's kind of why, on the one hand, why we're looking away, but on the other hand, the evidence is just in our face, and we really need to face the facts about this.
Yeah, I want to, Naomi, I was somebody who, I've read a little bit of your work before, and I'm familiar with Darcy Olson's Generation Justice, some of their work, but I really learned a lot because I didn't know a lot about where the real abuse comes from. Can you talk a little bit about when we're talking about all these kids who are being abused, and like, how should we be thinking about it? Because sometimes I think, and I had an assumption that a decent amount of the abuse, I would have probably guessed the majority, came from foster families themselves, not from the parents they were being taken away from. Can you talk a little bit about that and where the real risks lie?
Sure. So the first thing I think people should understand is that we're talking about both abuse and neglect. And actually, the majority of children who are removed from their homes are removed because of neglect. And the majority of child fatalities in this country from maltreatment are actually because of neglect. So what is neglect? It's a very vague term, unfortunately, but more often than not, it actually involves substance abuse or mental health problems. It's about parents who are unwilling or unable to care for mostly young children. Now, Carrie, you and I know how difficult it is to care for young children, how much attention an infant, for instance, needs, how many times a day you have to change them and feed them and rock them and comfort them. And then even when kids get to be a little bit older and they enter what I like to call the mobile but totally irrational stage, where they're trying to run out the front door or touch your hot stove or swallow Legos from their older siblings. Those situations can be very dangerous if we have a parent attention problem. Even if you're totally sober, those things are problematic to do. But for a parent who has a real addiction problem, it is really hard to keep a kid safe in those situations. And that's why you see such a high percentage of fatalities happening in those homes. And I tell people, if you want to understand what's driving the child welfare crisis in this country, it is our drug crisis. Almost all of the cases that I talk about in the book involve substance abuse, alcohol abuse, or mental illness in some way or another. And that is an important fact that we have to face. Just kind of thinking about what broadly are the things that, that we need to understand about these kids is that this is a particular problem for young kids. Once a kid gets to be like 12 or 13, you can say, not that they can raise themselves, but at least they know how to keep themselves out of danger. They can tell another adult if something goes wrong. But for kids like, 0 to 3, it's impossible to keep them safe if you're high. But also, those are the kids whose brains are developing in a particular way. And if we are at a point where, that child cannot form a secure attachment to their parent because they don't know that someone is always going to come to them for their physical needs or emotional needs, that will severely affect their brain development. We know this, and is going to have a large impact on their life later on.
Yeah. Naomi, when you were were talking about in the book, you talk about this idea that a lot of how much of a contribution that or contributing factor substance abuse is to the reason why kids are taken away from their families. And I found like one of the big themes of the book, if I were to, I think that one of the big themes you lay out is how our child welfare system is not so much focused on children anymore, but is often worried about the parent. And of course, as I say that, I'm like, that sounds really mean, because of course we should all be worried about the parents. A lot of these times, these parents are victims of our people who've been fallen. The system failed them, and now they're failing their biological kids. But can you talk a little bit about that, about what it means and what the damage is caused by this new kind of focus on parents as
Yeah.
almost being a higher priority or an equal priority to the kids.
Sure. I mean, I completely agree with you that these are parents who have no doubt suffered. They have suffered from poverty, from unemployment. Our education system has failed them. They're suffering from substance abuse. Some of them have been actually raised in the foster care system themselves. I mean, our heart should go out to them. But the problem is that now our child welfare system is now thinks of itself more as a family welfare system. And so the first question we ask when we find a child in danger or even have to remove that child from a home is how quickly can we get them back? And I compare this in the book to how we view domestic abuse. You know, if a policeman shows up at the home of a woman who has been beaten by her boyfriend or husband, imagine if the first question he asked was, how can we get you guys back together? Because that is the approach that we take in the child welfare system. It is all about family preservation and family reunification because we have come to see the parents as victims of the system in some way, and that the child welfare system seems now more suited to meeting their needs than meeting the best interests of the children.
Yeah. Can you, I thought that one of the things that really like that was so impactful in reading the book is these stories of kids who have had really terrible situation. They're taken out, they find a positive foster care situation, a family that loves them and is willing to really invest in them. And then they're taken back away. Can you like talk a little bit about that and how often that happens and really the impact both on the kids and then on the system itself, because it does seem as though, there's a lot of victims in that. And one is the people we really need to get into the system, and that's good parents.
Sure. One example I think that really illustrates a lot of these problems. There's a couple of women that I met that I spoke with who live in upstate New York. They're Claudia and Courtney Fantone. They have been fostering for years. They live in an enormous house. It's a mother and daughter, and they've had over 50 foster children come in and out of their homes. They're just open their hearts to these kids, and the vast majority of them were reunified with their parents, and some of them were adopted. But a number of years ago, a sibling group of 5 was dropped off at their home. The oldest child was actually 5 years old, and they said that they've never seen children who've suffered this level of maltreatment before. They were all in diapers, including the 5-year-old. They were barely verbal. One of the children, they reported his teeth were so rotted it took him an hour to eat a peanut butter sandwich.
Wow.
And these are kind of, and they realized quickly that the parents had actually been arrested in a drug ring, in a local drug ring. The area where they live has a huge substance abuse problem. And but within a couple of weeks of these kids being in their home, Child Welfare Service was immediately trying to figure out how to make visitation possible with these parents who had been literally out to lunch for 5 years, like had paid no attention to any of these children. So over the course of many months, the Fantones continued to care for them. For actually 3 years, they kept all these children in their home. One of the children was diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, which caused him to want to harm his siblings. And they actually, went to court on a couple of occasions and said, we really think this child, we're happy to adopt all of these children if that's possible. This child, though, needs some more intensive kind of services like mental health services, maybe an inpatient treatment program. And the caseworker was so irritated that they dared to speak up in court and criticize the way these kids were being cared for by the system that they received shortly thereafter a notice saying that within 10 days, all the children would be removed from their home after they had been there for 3 years. And there was literally nothing these foster parents could do. They have not seen these children for 18 months now. The only parents that these children really ever knew were just ripped away from them. And to me, it illustrates not only the potential for retaliation that you see in some child welfare agencies, but also just the complete misunderstanding of a child's development. They had finally started to make improvements. They were in a secure home. They felt like there were adults that they could depend on. And then, a family court and a child welfare agency just said, oh, we don't like you anymore, and that's the end. We treat these foster parents like they're glorified babysitters. We don't understand child development. We're making decisions about children on adults' timelines instead of children's timelines. I mean, to say even to a 3-year-old, oh, we're going to take up your case again in 6 months. I mean, that's a huge chunk of a child's life that we are just frittering away. So I just think it's important to understand this is not atypical. I mean, this is an extreme case in terms of the level of neglect, maybe, and the number of children, but the way that the system is treating these children in this case is not atypical.
Yeah. Can you also talk, in addition to the preference for like family reunification, you talk some about the idea of extended family care and the preference the system has. And again, I think you lay it out really well, because I think it's instinctively, to me, I'd say that would make sense, because of course, if that's my backup plan, even my brothers, if would take my kids or something, my parents, my in-laws, we all think of that but that's because I have a very stable family, and I bet most people listening to this have stable families. But can you talk a little bit about what that means for kids who are already in kind of a chaotic situation?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think what we have to understand about kinship care is that for most families, obviously, this is the backup plan. You'd have your mother, your sister, your brother take care of your kids if something ever happened to you. But you also have to think about the fact that if you were somehow incapacitated, would those relatives wait for the government to step in and take away your children before placing you? No, of course, your mother, your brother, or sister would be like, oh my God, Carrie is not able to take care of these kids. I am going to care for them. But so these families are already in a different category. They're families that waited for CPS to show up for these kids to be reported to the government before they decide to step in. But then the second problem is a lot of the dysfunction that affects the immediate family also affects the extended family. It's not always and everywhere, but a lot of times it's true. And I give the example for people who have read the book or seen the movie Hillbilly Elegy. So there you have a story. J.D. Vance describes, how his grandmother raised him after his mother was abusive and neglectful toward him. So he moved down the street in with his grandmother. The story has a great, happy ending, as everybody knows. First the Marines, then Yale. His grandmother kept him on the straight and narrow. But you have to actually read the whole story. So the grandmother who took him in was in an abusive marriage herself. And at one point, she doused his grandfather in gasoline and lit the man on fire. Now, is this the person that we would have chosen to foster a child or to take a child in who had been hurt by his own mother? I think not. And what you see when you look at child protective services and child welfare agencies is they often have much lower standards for kinship care. A lot of these people don't have to pass background checks, and the child welfare agencies think that, well, it's easier to put them with these relatives because they won't get blamed if something goes wrong because, well, they're with family. A lot of the emphasis on kinship care is also about people who are very focused on kinship care talk about kind of the shared blood of these kids and their relatives, which I think, in some cases, obviously, these are people you have connections with, but they're also stretching the limits of this logic to an incredible extent. I mean, I talked to foster parents who've cared for kids for 2 or 3 years, and suddenly a relative shows up out of nowhere from across the country, and these kids have never even met them before. And they're like, oh, well, it's better for him to be with relatives. No, it's better for him to be with the people who have cared for him for years and that he's formed an attachment to, not some, second cousin from, out of town. So I just think we need to understand that it seems like common sense, but there are big problems with kinship care.
Yeah. Emily, can you talk? Naomi, we got a really good question from Emily Raymond, who in our questions tab, that she talks about an author we did previously called Sarah Fay, and she had a really dysfunctional upbringing. And she discussed how she didn't want to leave her parents despite them being masked and there being instances of abuse and semi-neglect. What role do kids play in the process? And what role do you think they should? I mean, when you're thinking about the balancing these different interests in the whole system.
Sure. I think, we have to, obviously for older kids, who have been with their parents for, say, the first 10 or 12 years of their lives, we have to take into consideration, both the attachment that they form to their parents, excuse me, but also the fact that they're not capable of raising themselves, but they're also capable of knowing when there's danger happening. So they can go to another adult and say, like, I think my parent can't take care of me. Or if they find themselves lacking food or clothing, or that their house no longer has electricity, they can talk to other adults about that. And they're not in the same level of danger. I mean, unless there's like obviously, a lot of physical abuse going on. For younger kids, they just don't have that ability. They cannot, you cannot depend on a 4-year-old to be able to go someplace else and report to an adult what's going on in their home. So I'm all in favor of including the voices of these kids when they're older in terms of, where they would rather be. But we also have to consider something else. And it's heartbreaking to read the stories of people, former foster kids, who talk about the trauma of being taken away from their biological families. And often they will sort of have this rosy picture of how things would have been if they had remained at home. There's actually a great example of this in this new book out by this New York Times writer. It's about this girl named Dasani that she followed around. It was the cover of the New York Times magazine a couple of weeks ago. And the girl sort of was taken out. She got sent to the Hershey School, which is for kids from difficult homes. But she talks about, well, maybe things would have worked out better for her family if she had just been allowed to remain at home. And she kind of blames child welfare services for her problems. But the fact of the matter is that her mother was on drugs. She had multiple children. She was bringing strange men in and out of the house. The kids were experiencing abuse and neglect. And so it's always easier to say, well, if only I had been able to stay, things would have been better. But the fact of the matter is we have a responsibility to these kids to keep them safe. And so, we can't just let that view kind of cloud our understanding of what the role of child welfare services is.
Yeah, well, we've got another really good question, and that it was exactly where I wanted to segue next, which is from Kona. She says, Naomi, do you think the emphasis on kinship care is driven by the system's bias against transracial placement? And I'd love for you, this is obviously something you write a lot about, and how this focus on race has become the kind of warped some of what's happening in child welfare. So I'd love for you to tell everybody a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, I think the answer to the question is definitely yes. That kinship care has been a way of saying, like, we have to keep kids with caretakers who have the same color skin. But let me sort of back up a little and talk about the ways that people discuss the child welfare system now as being, quote unquote, systemically racist. It is true that a disproportionate number of Black children are investigated, removed from their homes, and in the foster care system right now. What they don't tell you is what is behind those numbers. A disproportionate number of Black children are actually maltreated. They're suffering from abuse and neglect at about twice the rate of white children in this country. And even more disturbing, they're actually 3 times as likely to die from maltreatment as their white peers. So child welfare services is about serving a need. It's not about kind of making our spreadsheet columns come out even. It's about going to the kids who are the most vulnerable and seeing what we can do to help them. Someone I know actually made this great comparison. He said, look, imagine if we started a program in St. Louis tomorrow that did lead abatement. And we told all the families in St. Louis, come to us if you have a lead paint problem in your home. And at the end of the week, we looked down at our clipboard or whatever, a spreadsheet, and we said, oh my goodness, we have many more Black families than are represented in the population in St. Louis. We're going to have to just take some of them off the list. I would obviously be crazy. You would look at them and say, well, look, a disproportionate number of these Black families are living in impoverished neighborhoods. Their homes have not been renovated in the last few decades. And so obviously you're going to have more of them, but our job is to help them and give them these services. And I think the same thing is true of child protection. We have to look at where the need is and then protect those kids. The next stage of this sort of, kind of racial ideology that I talk about having taken over child welfare is the emphasis on race matching when it comes to placing kids in for foster care or adoption. This is a very old idea and old problem. In 1972, the National Association of Black Social Workers came out with a statement that they have not retracted since, and basically says that they would prefer Black kids remain in the foster care system than that they be placed with white families. They would even be fine with Black kids going to group homes or orphanages rather than being placed with white families. The rhetoric at the time likened this kind of transracial adoption to slavery. And you hear that rhetoric coming back to us now. There was a moment in the 1990s where bipartisan group of legislators, Democrats and Republicans, came together and said, look, we don't want kids languishing in foster care. Foster care is supposed to be temporary. And we have a lot of Black kids who are not getting adopted because of this desire to keep them only with Black families. And so they passed something called the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, which says we cannot discriminate on the basis of race when it comes to foster care and adoption. And that was a really important law. And frankly, it allowed tens of thousands more Black children in this country to find safe, stable, and loving homes. And now people want to go back. They want to rewind the clock. So we go back to a point where we have to match the skin color of the child to the skin color of the caretaker. There are people who want to overturn the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, including major adoption agencies like Bethany Christian Services. It really is quite outrageous that people think that that is more important than finding safe, stable, loving homes for these kids.
Yeah, you write a little bit about the growing discomfort or the system's really rejection of faith-based care services or anybody who's any introduction of religion. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the consequences are? Like, what will it do to the system and more importantly to the kids who are in need if we do kind of stamp out the role of Christian, especially Christian? I know there's more than that, but a lot of these services, faith-based services.
Yeah, I mean, the majority of the heavy lifting in foster care in this country is done by people of faith. And I joke that it really is so hard that if God were not literally telling you to do it, a lot of people would be like, no, thank you. And by the way, it's not just that they're treated, that it's difficult to take in a child who has experienced this much trauma. It's also, as I said, that they're treated so terribly by the system. But that being said, a lot of faith-based organizations have really stepped up in the last 10 years or so. You've seen a revolution in the world of churches and faith-based foster care. They have changed the way we recruit and train and support these families. And they have brought a lot of new families into this. And, about half of foster families actually quit within the first year. So they need that kind of communal support that you get from a church or a faith-based agency. And now there are people who really want to throw them out of the business. There was a court case many people followed in the spring, Fulton v. Philadelphia, where a group of people sued Catholic Charities and the city of Philadelphia and said, we don't want the city of Philadelphia to contract with Catholic Charities anymore to do foster care because they don't place kids with gay couples. And Catholic Charities said, look, this is our religious identity. If someone comes to us, we're happy to refer you to an agency that will place gay couples. And no gay couple came forward to say that they had been unable to foster as a result, by the way. So this was a kind of completely abstract level of hurt, but driving Catholic Charities out of the business would have actually hurt any number of foster children who depend on them for these placements. So, from my perspective, let 1,000 flowers bloom. We should have as many foster and adoption agencies out there as possible to serve every kind of safe, stable, loving home that is imaginable, because these kids need homes and our focus should be on the kids, not the feelings of the adults.
Yeah, well, that's another, when we're talking about I'd love to turn, as we've laid out a lot about the problems and I'd look to two other really, I thought that things that surprised me, or this idea of kind of the kind of characteristics that you think social workers should have, because we've heard a lot about you bring up the idea of the defund police movement, said, hey, social workers can do a lot of the jobs of the police. But then you kind of flip the argument back and say, actually, a lot of the social workers in the child welfare system could use a lot more police training to be able to better serve these kids. Can you talk briefly about that? And feel free to go into other solutions of what you think actual positive reforms might look like.
Sure. So the child welfare agencies, unfortunately, just are not recruiting the best and brightest for these jobs. And they're very hard jobs. Some child welfare agencies have a turnover rate of 40%. So you're not even getting people who have experience on the job and then are staying in it. But imagine the job of someone in child protective services on the front lines. We are asking them to go out to a family's home, to knock on the door. They don't know who is on the other side, mother's boyfriend or whoever. And the door opens and they have to make some very difficult accusations and ask some very difficult questions. It is a dangerous situation. And we need to be training them as if they are engaged in law enforcement, because the next thing they have to do while asking those questions is start to look around and see what evidence they have of whatever claim has been made. Are there drugs all around? Does the child seem afraid to talk to you? Is the mother being told to not talk by the boyfriend? I mean, these are all sorts of things that we train police to do, but I think we need to train child welfare workers to do them too. And there's some agencies that are starting to kind of develop partnerships between police and social workers for these purposes, which I think is really important. The Another solution that I kind of on the what we call the front end of the child welfare system is with regard to the reporting. All these calls, tens of thousands of calls are coming into big city child abuse hotlines every day. And they can range from, mom left her kid in the car while she ran to the dry cleaner for 5 minutes and I want to report her. Those are a very small percentage of the cases, but they are going to the exact same phone number as, I think my neighbor might be beating his child, with a heavy object, and all I hear is screaming. So how do we as a system kind of marshal our resources to the right places in order to make sure that the kids who are most vulnerable and most in need are seen right away? So one thing I talk about in the book is the use of data and predictive analytics that could be set up in order to understand which kids are most urgently in need of our help. We have a lot of information about these families. Like, we could tell, for instance, from public, from records that they could have access to, like if a child hasn't shown up in school for the last 30 days. We could find out if a person who is incarcerated has recently re-entered that home. We could find out how many times they've been reported before for abuse, whether they have failed to show up to pick up some kind of food assistance or something like that. And all those numbers could get put into an algorithm that would not give you definitive proof someone had abused or neglected their child, but it would tell you how urgent is this problem for us to investigate. So I think that's a really important reform as well.
Yeah, that's terrific. That's very helpful. I see we've got some great questions in the chat, and it's interesting. Naomi, I know that from reading your book, I know that you hear a lot of stories, and this is so personal. We have someone telling of a situation where their granddaughter has now been placed in a home with a birth father who has felony criminal sexual assault charges, and they're obviously devastated that they've been caring. It looks like they've been caring for her. Do you have any what are advice? Is there anything you can help? What should kind of that on the ground person who is seeing this kind of thing? What can they do? And the frustrations with the child. Child protective services when they're failing to do their job.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these frustrations are coming in the form of family court as well. Foster parents regularly describe to me family court as kind of a kangaroo court. They can't figure out what laws are being applied and what rules are being applied. Foster parents actually and other caregivers have a right to speak out in family court permanency hearings, but they often hear from judges, I'm not interested in what you have to say. You're just a foster parent. I don't have to listen to you. And it's very rare that those kind of decisions get appealed up a chain of, up a judicial chain. So that becomes very difficult too, to kind of get your voice heard. And I hear these frustrations all the time. There are a couple of things that I think would be important reforms. One is there's actually a group I've become familiar with recently in California called Advokids, which runs kind of a legal help hotline for relatives and caregivers and foster parents who want to get involved in cases and see see that they're kind of going in the wrong direction, but no one's listening to them. And they actually help provide legal representation for these folks. I think another important thing for people to do, not necessarily those who are directly involved in the cases, but if you want to kind of make sure that these situations are being monitored, is to volunteer to be a court-appointed special advocate. Those are people who are meeting with the child in foster care. They're volunteers on a regular weekly basis. And when it comes to the court hearings, they actually will go and represent what they think is the child's best interest to a family court judge. And I think those people are important, not just because the child's voice, as I've said, is so often drowned out in these hearings, but also because I think it's important for kind of educated, responsible citizens to be present in these courtrooms and to be witnessing some of these dealings. Because I think, frankly, there are some judges and lawyers who would behave a little bit better and behave more according to the law if they thought someone was watching.
Yeah, and Naomi, that's what I mean. We're going to start closing out, but I think that that's the one thing. One thing I really took away from this is how closely you've been watching, and how much there needs to be people watching. Before we kind of just like fully wrap this up, we've had a couple questions about like the scope of this problem. We started the conversation with the number of 1,850 deaths or whatever. I know that things have gotten like worse during COVID. If you could talk a little bit about that, like where the numbers are going, but then why we should also worry about focusing on the numbers too much, because I know that's part of, they can game those numbers. So can you talk a little bit about that as we wrap up?
Sure. I mean, there was just another recent study that showed that the numbers of kids who were abused, school-age kids who were abused during the pandemic went up. And one of the reasons for that is that these kids were not being seen. They were doing, they were in lockdown doing remote learning. They were in homes that were experiencing significant amount of stress. As we saw from the increase in the number of drug overdoses, many of these kids were in homes where there was substance abuse that was a serious problem. And as a result, we see abuse happening. I mean, these kids need to be seen by other adults too, and teachers, doctors, and police officers are typically the mandated reporters who are talking to the authorities about what they're seeing in terms of abuse and neglect. I just, we talk about the numbers of kids, who are suffering right now, I think it's important to think about, just when I say that there are 440,000 kids in foster care. So some states will happily report that their number of kids in foster care went down during the pandemic, and they'll see this as a great win. I just want people to understand that that is a number that can be very much manipulated. You can decide, okay, I'm going to leave the kid in this home. We don't have enough foster homes to take this kid out. We have no place to put the kid. And look, I can happily report to all the citizens of my state that my foster care numbers went down. What you care about, though, is where your child maltreatment numbers are and where something called repeat maltreatment numbers are. Like if you take that kid out and put that kid back, and then they get abused or neglected again. I mean, how many times should a child have to deal with that just so that you can say, look, we have fewer kids in foster care? So I want people to kind of understand what's driving these numbers and which ones to be more wary of.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Naomi, I think I really encourage everyone to be sure to like get the book. It's not like it's too grueling to be a fun read, or it's too depressing, but man, it was enlightening and in many ways empowering. It really made me think, you're even thinking about us from an IWF perspective. I don't think I fully appreciated the scope of this problem and how important it is, because the kids who are going to be let down in childcare and these foster care programs today are going to be the people who have problems in the future. I know that's a big problem with homelessness, with crime. That would be your impression too, right, Naomi, that we ignore this at our peril.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we have to help these kids at a young age, because the longer we wait for them, and the more trauma they experience, the harder their lives are going to be later.
Yeah. Well, terrific. Well, I've got you guys, as we close up, as we said in the beginning of this, we're going to draw 3 names of this event to get our the signed books from Naomi, and we have our winners are Marie Prendergast, Rachel Bond, and Janet Russell. We will be following up and making sure to get these copies to each of you. So just to close this out, thank you, Naomi. It's such an honor to get the chance to speak with you, and we're really glad. I'm glad you're doing this work. I'm glad that you're part of IWF, and keep up the great work. Do you have any final thoughts to share?
Thank you. I mean, I hope people read the book, and if they want to get in touch with me, like I'd be happy to have this conversation further to find out like what you can do better in your own community, your own state.
Terrific. Well, thanks everybody. Please join us again for then we'll be sending out another email soon with our next author chat. So please, we are the Independent Women's Forum. This is just one of the many issues we cover. We're working on child welfare issues. We're working on spending issues, economic issues, healthcare. We have an amazing all-women staff, and please be sure to stay in touch with us. Tune in for the next author chat is going to be on November 4th. So stand by, and thanks again for joining us.